time to start. So I'd just like to thank you for joining today as we remember 9/11, 16 years later, with Dr. Gregory Fried. I'm Elaine Shuck, and I will be the facilitator for today. I have Rox, who is to my right, which will be revealed in a few minutes. I have Ken Kahn, just raise his hand, and the team from Plano, raise your hand, that will be supporting this event today. So I have a personal relationship with Dr. Fried, and I call him Greg. I've known him for 3 years. I met him through a mutual friend, and he shared his story. And since then, he'll tell you later, but he has written a book not only about 9/11, but about his life, sort of. I mean, he's picked some really great highlights that he will be sharing. Hold on one second. They're saying the pledge. Okay? And so, you know, one of the things that we do at Eye to Eye is, obviously, we're a technology company, but we also like to share amazing things. And as a team, we wanted to share this story with people not only live, like you're seeing today on screen, and then we have several that are watching it via stream. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Rox, and she's going to explain what we're going to do today, just so we're all on the same page.
Okay.
And Ken's going to share a slide.
All right, so welcome. I'm Roxanne Glauser, and I am going to be helping Elaine here, and I'm going to be the voice for all of our viewers that are viewing our live stream. Get your the method you're going to be using, get ready with that, and we're excited to hear Dr. Fried's story, and I look forward to the questions that I'll be able to ask for you.
Okay, also for the live interactive sites, after Dr. Fried's presentation, we are going to start with Rox, with the streaming audience, and she's going to take 2 questions from them. Then we're going to go to El Paso. Chapin High School, could you just introduce your school real quick so that Greg can get a visual?
Hi, my name is Edith. This is our leadership class, and we're from Captain John L. Chapin High School from Texas, from El Paso, Texas.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to move on to Homer, Alaska, with Miss Nelson's class. Could you have someone introduce your school, please?
Hi, we're from Homer High, and we are on the southern part of the Kenai Peninsula.
We have a population of about 5,000 people, and we are known as the halibut capital of the world.
And we're very excited to have a chance to interact with you today.
Thank you. The Kenai Central High School will be coming in a little bit late. These 2 classes, the Homer High School and the Kenai, they team teach, and their class is coming in a little bit later. So as we start asking questions, we will include them. Okay, so we are going to start, and I'm going to let Dr. Fried introduce himself, and he's going to be sharing a presentation. So without further ado, Dr. Gregory Fried.
Good morning, all of you. It's my pleasure to speak to you about an event that most of you can't even remember on a personal basis because you're too young, it's a very important event that affected all of your lives and will affect your lives from here on out. I'm going to show you some disturbing pictures and some real pictures, and I'm going to talk mostly about what happened to me, but I want you to understand that by seeing it through my eyes and the way I saw it, it'll give you a feeling for what it was really like that day and what it was like when somebody attacked America and tried to shake everything that we stand for. So without any further, I'm going to go to the slides, and I hope you have some good questions for me, and I hope this doesn't shake you too much. You're also going to see pictures that have never been seen before by anybody because they were taken on the first day and the first night. And all photography at that time, because of security reasons, was prohibited. So now I click on my thing, and do you see my screen?
We're seeing it.
Good. This is who I was on this September on September 11th, 2001. I was the executive chief surgeon for the New York City Police Department. This is my shield, or you guys would call it a badge, and here's my certificate that proves that I was really who I was. I grew up in New York City. I was a physician in New York City for years and years, and one of my favorite things was to wander the city and take pictures. This is a picture I took in the 1970s of the World Trade Center going up. Tower 1 had asbestos in it to the 77th floor. It was documented. It was in all the blueprints. So when people said that there was no danger and no harm, that wasn't true. I took this picture from the police helicopter. As the chief surgeon, I had the opportunity to fly with the guys, and we would fly over the city. This is Battery Park City over here, and it's actually from here that I was evacuated, but we'll get to that later. The helicopter pilot actually took us between the towers. On September 9th, I visited my daughter in Brooklyn. She had lived in Brooklyn Heights, and we walked on the promenade, which is a very lovely area in Brooklyn where you get to see the city. And ironically, I took pictures of the towers, which would be gone in 2 days. Some of the slides are very self-explanatory. These 19 people boarded planes. This person was the ringleader. He was the guy who really instituted it. But here are 19 people who plotted for months and years to attack America. I'll briefly go through these. 8 o'clock in the morning, flight takes off from Boston. 8:15, another one takes off from Boston. Both of them headed to Los Angeles, so they had full fluid or full fuel tanks full of the jet fuel. At 8:19, early, there was a notice by the flight attendants that the plane had been hijacked. It was hijacked, as you can see here, and this isn't a real picture of it. This is a simulated picture, but it was hijacked using box cutters. At 8:20, another flight outside of Washington took off. These are the flight plans. This is the Boston jet. This is the second Boston jet. And here's the flight from Washington. So that the flight controllers and the people who were involved all knew that these planes, they knew that this one was detoured right away because the flight attendant said it was hijacked. At 8:46, this flight crashed into the North Tower of the Trade Center. At approximately at 9:03, this plane crashes in to the South Tower. And they noted here that parts of the plane, including the starboard engine, the back engine, the left engine, leave the building from its east and north side, falling to the ground. I was contacted on my way into the city. I had operated on 2 patients prior, and on my way in, I was driving in, over came an announcement that the World Trade Center had been hit by a plane. The feeling was that perhaps it was an aberrant plane, it was a private plane. However, if you saw those flight patterns and you knew that there was contact, the flight controllers and the FBI and the people in power all knew this was a major hijacking and an attack. When I got to the World Trade Center, I turned on my siren because I had an unmarked police car, and I approached against traffic, and I got into the city in a very short amount of time because people were leaving. The tower, this is the North Tower, this is Tower 1, and it was on fire because it was hit first. Here's the second tower getting hit. This occurred pretty much at the same time that I arrived in Manhattan. I got out of my car. I'd been in enough situations and enough attacks and enough shootings to know that you park away from the situation so you don't tie up traffic and you're not in the way. So I started to walk, and I was picked up by a police van where they gave me a helmet, and we sort of looked at each other in silence, almost unbelieving as to the events that were going on. Here's what I told you about the motor. When I got out of my car, this was lying on the ground, and subsequent to this, it was taken to the landfill in Staten Island where they took all of the parts and all of the recovered items. And when I walked into the landfill and I examined it months later, I said, Lower Broadway. They looked at me, they said, how'd you know? I said, I saw it that day. When I got there, people were falling or jumping out of Tower 2. There was paper in the air, there was smoke in the air, and there were people falling out of the building. They had no choice. The fire was so intense that you would either burn to death or you'd leap. For what it's worth, they were all awake as they were coming down. I got out of my car, and as I approached, I was on West Street, which is just west of Tower 2, because we had set up there in 93. I had responded to this situation in 1993 when they tried to blow up the towers, and we were setting up a triage, namely a screening site for people who were injured, and we put them into ambulances and send them north. Most of you, I'm sure, don't know a lot about Manhattan, but we could send them north to a hospital to St. Vincent's or around the FDR Drive south and then north to Beekman Hospital. As I walked, I saw a firefighter who had been hit by the falling glass and shrapnel. This is before the tower exploded, and I was bending over to help him. He was bleeding from his upper arm or his shoulder, and although I had no equipment with me, I was going to stop the bleeding and put him into the van that I had just gotten out of. All of a sudden, somebody said, the tower's going down. And I looked up. I heard a loud, low rumble. I've never heard anything like it before or since. All of a sudden, it became very hot, and then it got cold. They told me the heat was from the jet fuel splashing down, and the cold was when the air conditioning units from Tower 2 erupted. Tower 2 was the second one hit. It was the first one to go down because it was hit sideways. That's what the engineers have determined. Prior to the tower going down, there was glass, there was steel, there was things falling from the building, and that's probably what hit the firefighter. When I described where I was and what had happened, I spoke to the people at the morgue. The fireman died, and they found his body at least a half a block away. I took no pictures that day. I never took a single picture afterwards because I knew everybody else did. But this is what I remember. This is how close I was. I was about 100 yards from Tower 2 when it came down, and that's what it looked like. There's a picture from a distance. It's a news picture, and it gives you an idea of what the debris was like and what it really looked like from that distance. And this picture was taken by the helicopter pilots who had responded after they heard what was going on. They had come from Brooklyn, and this is Tower 2 going down. This is looking from north to south. Over here on the right is where the Statue of Liberty is. The tower came down on top of me. I was buried up to my shoulders, and although these pictures show pretty much a symbol of what I remember seeing what was left of the facade, but since I was buried, the first thing I remember was it was pitch black. I couldn't see an inch in front of me. I was hitting my back and my shoulders, and I knew it was time to get out of there. But here it was so black, it was like this. It was midnight in a coal mine. I thought originally I had gone blind, and I was trying to figure out why I'd gone blind. I didn't see a big flash of light like they say would blind you, and I hadn't gotten hit in the head, because being hit in the head sometimes can cause temporary or permanent blindness. And I started to stare and look around, and then I'm thinking, because I was a surgeon, what good is a blind surgeon? And from a very distant, from way over somewhere, I heard someone going, help me. Pretty much everyone in my area was either evacuated or killed at the time of this event. I think these are the kind of things that hit me in the back, because from that moment on, I felt a tingling and a numbness that I still have occasionally in my leg, down my back, but fortunately I was able to walk. Oops. This is what it looked like. I decided, slowly I stared up into the sky, and I saw a light coming off the Hudson River, which was west of me. And I knew that I had to get out of there. These are pictures of people evacuating, the air was a lot thicker than this. This one shows an immediate aftermath, probably within the first half hour or so. These are later pictures, but it gives you some feeling for what the air was like. You could barely breathe. It was so thick, you could actually feel it with your hands, and all of us who were survivors or who were killed were covered in this gray ash because it was pulverized building. I dug myself out because there was no one around there to help me, and I sort of pulled myself up, but I could feel that I was bleeding. I was bleeding from my back, but it wasn't external bleeding, it was all internal. I started to swell, I got dizzy, and one of the signs that I was a trauma surgeon that we know about is thirst. When you're very thirsty and nothing else is going on, very often it's because you're in shock. The harbor units, it's the Hudson River. The harbor units had heard what was going on, and the harbor boats, here's one of them, these are the police launches, started to respond from the Hudson River to come and pick up survivors. They came in, this is the initial ash cloud and the initial dust cloud that blocked the sun, and you can see now why it was pitch black. My friend Greg took this from the helicopter. He was one of the helicopter pilots, and he gave me these pictures. These pictures, most of them have never been seen. This is my rescue boat. These were the guys from the harbor unit. This is Jimmy Cowan. He was a sergeant. He and I were friends. I used to ride with the boat all the time because it was fun. They patrol the Hudson River. They patrol the East River. They pick up survivors. And they came heading for the harbor and for the survivors to evacuate them. You see, the boat is small. This is the only picture I have that even begins to show how I was rescued. I walked west and I ran into Bernie Carrick. Bernie Carrick was the police commissioner at the time. I ran into his bodyguard and I asked, his name is Sean Crowley, and he and I have remained, we were friends and we've always remained friends. And I said to him, how's the police commissioner and what's with the mayor? Both of them had been trapped in another building, and they were released when the bodyguards had to shoot out the glass so they wouldn't be trapped in the building. Anyway, I walked down this street here. You guys can see the arrow, right? Anyway, I walked down this street, and this is Liberty Street. And I came to the seawall, which is over here. And the harbor boat continued around, and picked me up over here. I got to the wall, and the water level was about 20 feet below. So I looked at the guys, I said, you know, if I don't get out of here, I'll probably bleed to death. So they put up a ladder, and somehow they either pushed me down or carried me down. I don't have much memory of exactly how I got there, but somehow I got on the harbor boat, and they headed west towards New Jersey because there was no possible way of going back. This is what happened. This is what it was like in Manhattan right afterwards. They closed everything. I had contacted my wife to tell her, I had had a cell phone at the time, to tell her I was on my way to the event. And after that, the police department came out to pick us up, to pick her up in Long Island to visit me. But as you can see, it was almost impossible to travel in New York City. This is within an hour of what happened. These pictures are going to give you some idea of what it looked like in the first hours after the Trade Center was attacked. This is, they call it the Winter Garden, and it's a mostly glass building, and it's about 150 yards from where Tower 2 went down. And you can see the massive destruction and the demolition and all the things that happened to it. This was taken that afternoon from the helicopter, and it gives you a feel for what the air was like, for what the destruction was like. And I'm not in any of these pictures. However, this is about 4 blocks away. You notice the wreckage, the destruction, the cars, the ambulances. No one could get anywhere. This is a city street. This was taken the first night, and the cops had set up their lines. These pictures have never been seen because they were restricted. The mayor and the president and the security people felt that it was inappropriate to take pictures initially. They didn't know exactly who had committed the attack and who had done this, so they just stopped the pictures. These are all police pictures. Here it is, the army of firefighters and cops and rescue workers and engineers, all of whom responded the first night. This is a picture from the first night. Again, another picture from the first night to give you some idea of what it was like. Nobody knew how many people were killed. Nobody knew how many people survived. I was literally down the block from this because I remember the facade sitting there in the most eerie and bizarre way you could imagine. And all these people were there for only one reason, and that was to pull people out of the rubble. This is what they faced. This is slightly north, and here in the middle is the World Trade Center globe that sat between the Twin Towers and has subsequently been rescued and is back on display down there. But this was the middle between the two World Trade Centers, the two towers. Other pictures of later rescue and what have you. They brought in the cranes to start lifting the rubble, but it took about a week or 10 days before they were convinced that they could start lifting up some of this horrendous amounts of steel because they didn't want anyone who was trapped to be killed. This picture is the first day when they brought in, they call them rescue dogs, and all these dogs have died of lung disease and exposure. You'll notice nobody except for a few people are wearing any sort of respirators or masks or protection because there was no way they could get it all to them. In addition, at that time, there were only 500 of them, 500 masks available. So most of the guys went in with either masks or handkerchiefs on their faces and did it to rescue people. This was a fire truck. Here's what it looked like during the rescue operation. Can you imagine approaching this, trying to find bodies or people among all this ruin? It was all done by hand. This is probably a week to 2 weeks later when they started carrying out the stuff. They didn't want to bring in large cranes and lift up all the debris because they didn't want to miss anything. It speaks for itself. They had to set it up somewhere, and they would take out the bodies and bring them there and then send them up to the medical examiner's office. I had met the medical examiner several times, and he and I were good friends at one point, and the amount of work that hit the medical examiner's office was just incalculable, and it took them years to figure out who was who. This is a Deutsche Bank. This was a block and a half away, but as you can see, there was so much destruction that eventually they had to tear this building down. And this is about 3 weeks later, before they removed the facade. These are the facade of Two World Trade Center. This is me getting my medal. I figured I would show off a little bit since I am giving a presentation, but they gave me a Medal for Valor for responding. This is Police Commissioner Kelly, and this is my wife, Ann. These are some of the statistics. There were 343 firefighters killed. There were 23 police officers and 37 Port Authority cops killed. But there were a lot more than that were killed. 2,753 people were killed, according to the statistics that they had, with only 1,585 identified. There are still 1,100 and some odd victims who have never been identified. They still keep the remains in the medical examiner's office in the event that they perfect better ways of DNA analysis and stuff. There were 5,500 people who were awarded injury claims from the Federal Compensation Fund. They passed a multi-billion-dollar bill to award those people who were seriously injured or killed. These were all young people, or most of them were very young people. They were all working people who were down there. This is a very alarming statistic. On August 15th, CNN, of 2016, last year, CNN reported there were 5,400 cases of cancer in the rescuer and recovery workers. You saw what it looked like. You saw what the dust was like. You saw what the clouds were like. And that's basically the people who risk their lives. It's easy to look at statistics, but sometimes it's really important to understand that these were all people. They all had families. I put up these 5 faces because these were all close friends of mine. Timmy Roy was a sergeant. He had responded. He had come from the police academy. He, in his spare time, was a contractor, and he worked on my roof of my house, and he was covered with tattoos. 3 months later, when they uncovered his body, they identified it by his tattoos. Moira Smith had been on the police force for 13 years. She left a 2-year-old daughter that day, and she had gone back into the building several times to lead people out. Terry Hatton was a firefighter whose wife was Rudy Giuliani's personal secretary. I'm still very friendly with Beth. Beth was 7 months pregnant at the time, has a 16-year-old daughter today, and it took them 4 months to find what was left of his body. Understand that none of these bodies were found intact. They were just fragments of what was left of them because of the crush. Michael Judge was a good friend. He was a Franciscan. He was a very close friend because he was devoted to the police and firefighters. This picture was taken by a news photographer. He was the first person who was pronounced dead at 9/11. And the irony of this picture is he's surrounded by the different services. There's a police officer and a firefighter and a Port Authority person, all of whom felt when he died of getting hit in the back of his head by falling debris. And they took him to his parish and they laid him out on the altar. He was an incredibly important and lovely man. John O'Neill was an FBI agent who had been assigned to the FBI and left the FBI under some strenuous circumstances. He had spent time in Afghanistan. He was aware of what was going on, and he and I were good friends. In August of 2001, he had called me to tell me he had gotten a new job. He was chief of security for the World Trade Center. Suggested that at some point I come down and we have lunch. 2 books have been written about him, The Man Who Knew and The Man Who Warned America. John O'Neill had contacted the White House and told them, this is bin Laden. He had gone, he was in the building, he had taken his entire office staff out, came back to rescue more of his office staff, and came back a 3rd time, and that's when his tower went down and killed him. Okay, I think we're done with the presentation. I put in a plug for my book. If you want to know more about it, if you want some details of my life as a police surgeon or what it's like to become a surgeon or to work at that sort of stuff, all of that's in the book here. I was there when Y2K happened, it's the year 2000. I had done surgery myself, and you just heard some of the stories of 9/11. If there are questions, I'm going to switch back.
Just a reminder again for those of you joining us with the live stream, we have some additional questions that are coming in. So remember, you've got your chat box option, you've got hashtag on Twitter, I2I shares 9/11, and events at i2itech.com. So Greg, as we get started, first you've got a couple of thank yous that came in actually before any questions. So Eric, I believe you know Eric, said that just thank you for providing this service and how important it is for us to hear firsthand. So those of you listening, so Eric is Greg's son. And then George also sent in a little note of his appreciation for your dedication and your service through the years. So those were just 2 compliments and thank yous that came in. So Richard has our first question, and it starts with, it says, some of the most shocking images from 9/11 were seeing people jumping to their death and watching the towers fall. So those 2 are very iconic. And his question is, what are your thoughts about how those images are kind of seldom shown 16 years later when recounting that day? I guess kind of an extension, because you showed us a lot of images that we hadn't seen. So just kind of what's your response there to Richard's question?
I think those are important images. I think they're very important to understand that these are people. That this was not just a generic event that occurred, but each one of those individuals, everybody who perished, everybody who was seriously injured, everybody who was involved had a life, and the people who came out of the building were probably from Cantor Fitzgerald. They were working. They were honest, young people. Most of them were very young people and were facing death from burning to death or from jumping, and opted to jump as opposed to being burned to death. But I think that those images and the images of the towers coming down remind you that this was not just something you see in the movies or something that goes away. The families had to live with these images, and everyone else who was involved with that had to live with these images. I saw a woman come down directly in front of the van as we were approaching it, moving until she hit the ground. So that you realize these are people, and these are the kind of things that remind you of what an important and tragic event it was and how it affects all of our lives.
All right, thank you for that. We have another question just came in through our chat. And Janet is curious about what types of video conferencing or telemedicine technologies were used to triage or treat victims during this tragic event, and also a thank you for your service. So that was from Janet. So what types of technology were used in that during that time?
Yeah, that's a very easy question. None. One of the reasons there were 343 firefighters who were killed was because nobody from Tower 2 could communicate with them. It was several hundred yards north, Tower 1, and nobody warned the firefighters that Tower 2 had gone down. If there was some reasonable communication, if there was this sort of technology or any sort of technology, they could have saved a lot more lives. At the time, for what it's worth, it was estimated that there were 20 to 30,000 people in those buildings. And heroes like Moira Smith and like Timmy Roy and hundreds of other heroes risked their lives and sacrificed their lives to get the people out. Originally, there was an announcement that said, stay in place. They didn't know if the building was going to go down or not. The firefighters set up in the lobby of Tower 1, and nobody told them that Tower 2 had gone down, so they couldn't even get out. And they started climbing. There was a total rethinking of all the processes that involve high-rises and high-rise fires. And in addition, they've changed the approach on the planes. Now, if a plane is hijacked, it's been recommended. In those days, an event like this never occurred. So it was recommended that if you're hijacked, you do what your hijacker tells you, and they expect it to land somewhere. Subsequent to that, they've decided that if indeed a plane is hijacked, attack your hijackers.
Nice. Thank you so much. And you also answered a couple other questions that have come in, so I'll make notes of those. So when we come around again, I'll be asking more questions. Thank you so much, Dr. Fried.
If this kind of
Thanks,
technology, even simple technology was available, things might have been a whole lot different. Are we done?
Okay.
No.
Nope, Luis, we're going to have more questions. So we're going to go to El Paso, Chapin High School, for your 2 questions, please.
You said that when you were laying there, like, you couldn't see, you were, like, seeing pitch black. What were your thoughts? Like, what were you thinking? Like, what were your thoughts in your, like, what, I don't know.
I remember vividly that. My first thought was that I'm blind, and what good is a blind surgeon? And then when I saw this little band of light coming over from the Hudson River, I realized I wasn't blind, that somehow this cloud had blocked out the sun. And then very simply, I started getting thirsty. I knew I was bleeding. My thought was, get the heck out of there. And that's what I did. I dug myself out. There was nobody around. My area was called the kill zone, and there was nobody around to help me out of there. So what you do is what you got to do, and that is get out. I've spent, at that time, I spent 25 years as a surgeon, and one thing I don't do is panic. Panic doesn't do you a whole lot of good. All I knew is if the tower had just gone down to my east, I was going west, and that's what I did. I climbed over the rubble. The firefighter I thought about, and he was gone. his blood, it turns out, was all over my pants because I had bent down on him to try to help him. And when I got to Jersey, where they evacuated me, and I got to the harbor, they asked me if I'm bleeding from my legs. And I said, no, I wasn't. I eventually cut my pants legs off and gave them to the morgue where a friend of mine worked, and he compared the DNA, and that's how they identified the fact that they knew who it was. So my thought was, get out of there.
And then our second question was, obviously this was a very traumatizing event. Like, how do you get over something like this? Like, every year you retell the story, like, how do you feel?
It's funny. Some people never get over it. Some people can't get past it. I think probably, well, I also had friends who were psychologists, and I spoke to them at length. And every time I'd have some sort of symptom or something would bother me, I would call them up. My friend Nancy is a psychologist. Nancy, is this normal? Is that normal? And she'd say, yeah, it's normal. Some people have lived with post-traumatic stress forever. They still have it. In fact, over time, it doesn't seem to get better for a lot of people. In fact, it somehow hurts more. I think that in my career, I've seen a lot of really sad and terrible things. And I think somehow I can put it at a distance, whether it's just a skill of mine or just I'm lucky that way. But I tell the story because I want to share with you people exactly what the events were like. And it's my way of remembering all those people who were lost.
Thanks, Greg. Or Dr. Fried, sorry. Okay, we're going to move over to Homer High School for your two questions, please.
Hi, my name is Kimberly. I'm from Homer High School, and first I'd like to thank you very much for your service. And secondly, I'd like to ask you, if not for the accident, would you still be a surgeon, like today?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I actually had planned to go back to work. This was September. I spent about 4 or 5 months sort of lying around. I was hospitalized for 4 days, at which point it was clear to me they weren't going to do much. I broke my back. I crushed a bunch of ribs. I bled. I had a sinus burn that eventually caused all kinds of complications. But my thought was maybe I'd go back to work. Crushing your back makes it very hard to stand. And if I stand for more than an hour, even today, or if I sit for more than an hour or two, it hurts. And you don't want a surgeon who's distracted and who can't totally pay attention to everything that's going on. So it was clear to me that it was time to move on, and I left. The other thing that happened was, and I would respond to all the shootings. If you happen to buy my book, and I'll put in another plug, you'll read about the fact that I responded to most of the shootings and the traumas of police officers. In January of 2002, two officers were murdered in Staten Island, and I live about 25, 30 miles from Staten Island. It took me almost an hour to get there. When I got there, I couldn't get out of the car. People had to literally lift me and help me get out of the car. And that was clear to me. It was time to move on to something else. I've had full career since then. I only wrote the book because a couple of nurses at my last complication talked me into it to put down some of my adventures and some of the experiences I had. And I thought it was important to do. Just as sharing this with you guys, you are all too young to remember the event, but the event really affected your lives more so than you'll ever know until you really start looking at how things have changed. But it's important that everybody takes it with them. This is not the Civil War. This happened in your lifetimes or in your parents' lifetime, and it changed this world. It changed our country, and it's changed the way we look at things. So basically, I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
I'm Bethany, and I was wondering, how long did it take you to recover from your injuries?
I still haven't recovered. I still have complications occasionally. I have aches and pains and the usual stuff. It took me about 4 to 6 months to get moving around again, to be able to drive again, to get out of the house on occasion. My wife, to my good fortune, and because I'm smart, I married a nurse. So she was helping me out. I went for physical therapy, and then I would talk to my psychologist. But physical injuries you can sort of get past, and emotional injuries you have to work your way through, and all these things together change your life. And it's not a matter of just recovering, it's a matter of finding what matters. And that's what I did.
Thank you.
Thank you, Homer High School. Let's move over to Kenai for your 2 questions, please.
My name's Meg, and this morning we had a remembrance for the 9/11 victims, and I would like to thank you for your service. And my question is, what are we doing today, like, that is, like, helping the refugee, like, the victims and, like, the people who did their service?
I'm talking to you guys, and I'm letting you guys see exactly what happened that day so you can talk to each other and you can figure out how this fits in your lives. You people are young, and this is your future, and you're going to have to address it. So the most rewarding thing I can do, there's no point in me reading people's names, and no point. I remember the people who I cared about. I remember what happened, but by me sharing it with you, I make this very personal, and that is the tribute that I have to those people who were injured and killed. As I said, 5,400 people got cancer from working at the World Trade Center, and this will bring across to you people what your obligations are in terms of the future and this country and all these other things. So basically that's it.
Thank you.
We just have one right now, Elaine. Miss Shuck.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Zorbis. We're going to go back over to Rox for questions from the streaming audience.
And thank you so much. For our streaming audience has been very, very active. So again, use that hashtag I2I Shares 9/11, your chat box online or email coming in. So first off, thank you to Irene, Steph G, and Corey. They're just extending their gratitude to you, Dr. Fried, for sharing your story. A couple others, Jennifer and Gary, both had questions kind of like ongoing anxiety. I know you've touched some on that. Gary had an interesting spin on that. He wanted to know if you feel that your training as a surgeon helped you to kind of deal with the anxiety and to be able to kind of move past that. So he was very curious about that training piece that went into it.
My experience as a surgeon taught me basically how to put things in perspective, I think, and how to put things at a distance. What happened to me, what happened to these people, I can't let it change my life and bear down on me to the point where I'm non-functional. So that I learned to put it at a distance. I've seen young people die of breast cancer. I've seen people shot and killed. I've been an attendant at police officer killings and murders where young cops go out in the morning, say goodbye to their wife, and never come home again. And I guess over time you learn to deal with these things in some sort of way. You sort of block it. Again, if you read the book, all these incidents are in it, and it's more than just 9/11. But as a matter of fact, I almost died of hepatitis when I was in training. So that as a physician, you learn to defend yourself mentally, and unfortunately, you prepare for incidents that most people can't deal with at all. You know, there's nothing like having to tell a young pregnant woman that her husband who left that morning is dead.
We have a shift a little bit, but this also is about your training. Connie had a question, and Connie actually is working with her group that's viewing our stream is actually a class. They're in a college. I think they're studying early childhood, and they're curious about, they're going to be getting their CPR AED first aid training. So this group that looks like they're going to be teachers working with young children. How could more people having that type of training like been helpful at 9/11, and I think kind of one of the things I'm hearing from you is kind of looking forward for everybody there. So could you talk a little bit about that?
That's a great question. I've spoken to people I grew up in Long Beach, Long Island, and I've spoken to young people in the high school, and some of whom have aspirations of becoming physicians or nurses or the paramedics or what have you. And one of the things I tell them is that the Red Cross course is very simple, very straightforward, and very appropriate. And one of the reasons I encouraged it was in Long Beach, occasionally people drown, etc. So what happened was last week was the beginning of school, and I was contacted by the health teacher who said to me, one of the young ladies came back to school with the most exciting story. She said, based on the discussion I had had with them last year about the need to learn CPR and to be able to do something to help, her father had a heart attack in the house, and she performed CPR on him, and she saved his life. And the reason she knows she saved his life was based on the fact that when she described what happened to the paramedics, they said, if you hadn't been able to do it, he would have died. Now, she didn't only save his life. Think about how many other lives that touched and how many other people. He was apparently in his 50s or 60s. I'm going to Long Beach tomorrow, and I'm looking forward to meeting her. But it's like, what's the difference between being able to do something like that or standing around while somebody dies? I talk about this all the time because car accidents kill people, drownings kill people, and overdoses do occasionally. And if you're capable of doing something as simple as CPR, you really should learn it. So I think it's an incredibly great story that she told, and I think it tells people something easy that you can learn, so you're not just standing there. So I thank you for that question. I think it's a great question. I think if you learn nothing else, all the Red Cross offers is these courses that are very basic, AED and things like that, and you save people's lives. And how important, think about being able to save your father's life.
And you know, that reminds me too of like so many stories anytime we do have like a big event or even small ones, but that story of like the everyday hero, you know, to where it's being able to, you know, do something, like you said, instead of just like, okay, what do I do? So thank you again so much. So we have other questions coming in. So on the next round, I'll be ready to go. Thank you, Dr. Fried.
Thanks, Rox. Okay, let's go to El Paso for your 2 questions, please.
Yeah. You can come back to us.
Okay, sounds good. Let's move over to Homer for your 2 questions, please.
Hi, my name's Carmen, and I was wondering, how many people did you personally help during 9/11?
None, just me. But it turns out that over the night of 9/11, only 20 people were pulled out of the rubble, and that was it. The expectation was that there'd be hundreds of survivors. The entire New York City hospital system set up to fix and to help people and to find people who were injured. Nobody was saved in terms of that. 20 people were pulled out of the rubble. Of the thousands who were injured and killed, only 400 people spent more than 48 hours in the hospital. The entire ambulance system, everything was geared up. Every emergency room was cleared, expecting thousands of survivors like we had in 1993. Only 400 people ended up in the hospital. Everyone else died. So you were literally either killed or you walked away from it. And the good news was that the police and the firefighters and everybody else got the people out of the buildings before they came down, or they might have lost 10 times the number. But I personally, there was nobody to save. And by the time the building came down, which was the first tower, I got myself out of there. So the only one I helped really was me. The firefighter died.
Hi, I'm Sienna. I was wondering, like, how different was
responding to 9/11 than other events that you've responded to previously?
It's a very good question. It was totally, the only thing that even was close was 1993. And at that time, there was no fires in the tower. It was a whole different thing. It was a big crater when there was a bombing. But it was a totally unreal, unworldly situation where you just had no idea how it would turn out. No one thought those buildings were going to come down. So it was really, you did what you had to do. You got there, you prepared. We set up a triage area, and we were setting up on a triage is a way of screening people who are seriously injured. And we were ready to set up and put people in ambulances as we normally would. But it was totally abnormal. And when the buildings went down, it was originally thought that we might have lost 20 or 30,000 people.
Thank you.
In Homer, if you have a question, go ahead and ask your question. The gentleman that's standing. Go ahead.
Dr. Fried, how did you learn how to write?
How did I learn how to write? Oh, the book, you mean?
Yeah.
All I did was put my stories down, and the good news was I'm married to someone who does know how to write, and she edited for me to put it into a decent language and to sort of screen it a little bit so it made more sense. But basically, all I did was narratives. What happened was the thing that inspired me was when I was in the hospital from a complication of 9/11, I had two really devoted nurses, young nurses, and as I recovered, I would tell them more and more of the stories, and they said, you really got to write this down. So I did, and then I gave it to my wife and said, now put it in English, and she did.
Thank you. We are back over to Rox again. She says their questions are coming in.
They are. Thank you again so much to those of you viewing the live stream. I really appreciate you taking time to interact with us. So this question came from Patricia, and then I've got a couple others that are related to it. So Patricia's question was just pretty straightforward, was that do you think people thought that the towers would actually come down as soon as they did?
No one thought they were going to come down at all. People were convinced that they were secure. The engineering reports and everything else, including the firefighters who'd been involved with high-rise fires, there are no other high-rise fires that have ever had buildings collapse. In fact, in retrospect, there are all these conspiracy theories about how they demolished it, and all of which have been debunked by engineers who examined what went on. But nobody who was there ever thought those buildings were coming down.
Okay, and so the follow-up would be, it's really apparent, like the airport security procedures that were put in place post 9/11, but what other, impacts do we have that have like changed our, society going forward that, it's like 9/11 changed us forever. So what are some other things, in addition to, it sounds like procedures for high-rise fires are in place. So what are the things that have changed, and then kind of a summation of that, or what do you think the lessons we've learned from this are?
Well, these questions can last days and people can debate them forever, but very simply, not only did they change the security, but the main thing they've done is they've started to think and realize that things they don't contemplate can actually happen, like the fact that people can hijack a plane with a box cutter. Years ago, you could get on a plane with a box cutter. That's how they hijacked it. They didn't have guns. They got on with that. So people have started to realize that there are other methods and other things. The main thing that happened is this country became aware of a generalized evil that can possibly affect our own personal lives. The other thing that happened was everyone in the country is now aware of the fact that we can be attacked in our own homes, in our own places that we live, so that people are more aware of security. Some of the things that have changed specifically is if someone is attempting to hijack a plane, the passengers are advised to go after them, not to sit there complacently or sit there and obey what they have to say. Years ago, the hijackings were Cuba and places like Algeria, and people would obey whatever the hijacker said to avoid it. They've locked the compartments, so you can't get into the pilot's area. The doors are secured. You go through all kinds of screenings at the airport. Years ago, once upon a time, which I can still remember, you could actually go out on the tarmac and go up a flight of stairs and get on a plane. Years ago, you could go to LaGuardia or Kennedy Airport 20 minutes before your flight, jump on the flight, and get to Boston in less than 2 hours. And now you go through all the security, and the security is real. Now there are barriers and barricades in front of all the major buildings that are potentially attackable. Years ago, the federal courthouse down in Foley Square and places in Manhattan were accessible. Now you go through metal detectors. Now your life has been restricted a lot. The young people who are sitting here now have been affected directly by these new security measures, and they're used to them. Some of us aren't. You know, we still find it annoying and onerous because it's changed things. You could get on a flight a half hour before. You could get to the airport a half hour before. Now it's 2 and 3 hours. And it's not just here. It's Europe. It's all kinds of international places. Things are different. There are bad folks out who want to see people get killed. And why, I can't even begin to dwell upon, but there's been major, major changes. You know, it's this kind of stuff. In addition, now the attitude about school shootings have changed, and this is also impacts the evil that's going on, so that young people are taught what to do in the event that there is some shootings in the schools and things like that, or public places. People are more aware of their surroundings. Times Square now has cameras all over the place and has barriers, so it makes it more difficult for bad people to do bad things.
And we have one more question. Can we have time for one more from Susan?
Sure.
Again, she says, thank you, Greg. And her question is a little shift. Do you think enough is being done to continue to monitor and help support the health of our first responders and volunteers? If not, what else do you think could be done to help?
That's sort of a value judgment. Do I think enough is being done? Well, I'm selfish, and I want everybody to get proper medical care. I think everybody should be monitored or treated. I was one of the early arguers for the fact that those pictures you saw caused cancer. At one point, a lot of people opposed that attitude, and they said there's no science behind it, et cetera, et cetera. When you saw those pictures and you saw what was on that ground, and you can sit there and tell me that that wasn't negatively affecting people's health, that's nuts. And finally, the government and the people in power have come to realize that there's a lot more cancer cases. And, you know, the question is, if it takes 10 years or 20 years or 30 years to understand that's what's going on. So do I think that they deserve it? Yes. I think the first responders deserve it. I think the people who are affected by it deserve it. And science notwithstanding, I think you're going to have to give, I think everyone should give anybody who is involved with that the benefit of the doubt. And if they develop cancers, they should be treated. If they develop lung disease or heart disease or some of the other stuff, and I've advocated, I've also had to testify to that fact. Can I prove it? It's an event that never happened before. They say that the particles, the particulate matter was so fine that the only time they saw particles that small was at Mount St. Helens after the eruption of the volcano. It's some of the things that are really remarkable about what happened. There was not a single fluorescent bulb found intact. There was not a single computer found intact in all of the rubble. There were computers on every floor, and every computer had 4 pounds of lead in it and 3 pounds of mercury or some other amount of, I don't know how much mercury, but every fluorescent bulb had mercury in it. So what we did was I tested my police officers, my responders for mercury, for lead, for beryllium, for all kinds of heavy metals and all kinds of other things. This was a soup. This was a combination of horrible things that no one's ever seen before. But everything was pulverized, so it was real easy to ingest and inhale. My own personal and selfish feeling was, since I wasn't down on the pile very often, I didn't get exposed to this stuff on a daily basis. Some of the police and firefighters worked 16 hours, 5 to 6 days a week. They were busy in the dig. They were out there handing the residual stuff to each other to try to find bodies and find personal belongings. Moira Smith was identified by her crushed shield, which is in the museum, and her crushed gun.
Thank you so much for sharing this. It looks like Elaine needs to go.
No, real quick.
To Elaine.
Thank you, Rox. Let's just, real quick, let's get, I know some of you are going to have to leave because you're students. If you can stay, that'd be fine. We'll stay for a couple more questions. So let's just give Dr. Fried a big hand before everybody has to leave. Thank you very much for attending. So maybe we'll take, I know we're running out of time, but let's just take, I know Greg, you've in El Paso. Why don't we take one more question from you if you have it? We'll take one more question from Kenai, and then we'll take one more from our streaming audience. So El Paso, go ahead if you have a question.
They answered the question.
I think they've answered it, but I think they've answered. You can say thank you.
Okay. I'm Alicia, and this is, we would like to thank you for your service. And you already answered the question we were going to ask. So thank you.
Thank you, El Paso. Let's go over to Kenai.
Either one of you, it doesn't matter. He's gonna go. Now you're both gonna go.
My name's Zion, and we were late, so I was wondering where you were and what you were thinking when this was all going down.
When it started, I was in a car. I was heading into the city to send 2 patients of mine home from the hospital. What was I thinking? I thought a plane hit the World Trade Center, and I belonged there because there'd be a lot of injuries. So very straightforward, very simple. Go because you got people who need help.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to go over to Rox again for our very last question or questions. You can stay on if you like.
And actually, this one we have answered all of the questions, and so just to reiterate, the kind of unanimous from the stream has been thank you so much for sharing this story.
It wasn't about me. This was about all of us, and this was about all those people who responded, all those people injured, and all those people who.
So I would just like to wrap it up. I'll put the screen on me so you can see me say that. Thank you again. I2I will be sending an email out to all of those who register, so you will have access to this recorded video. So thank you again, Dr. Fried. It's always a pleasure to have you join us and share your story. So thank you very much.